Hello everybody and welcome to Toy to You Curator's Corner episode 38. My name's Sean Brosnan. I'm a curator at Toi to Otago Settlers Museum, offering these little stories about our early history. The last episode centred on oatmeal and touched on local production versus imported supplies. Today we're going to carry on that theme and talk about some of the other food staples that were really critical to survival of the early settlement but were quite hard to get hold of, and shortages of which touch very directly on the lives of our pioneer settlers, affecting them in their bellies, as it were. We probably got just a hint of that in the first days of the pandemic earlier in the year, when there was panic buying at the supermarkets and toilet paper was stripped from the shelves and there were fears that other things like flour might run out. Well, our pioneer forebears didn't have the luxury of toilet paper, but they did face shortages and complete running out of things like flour and other staples, including tea and salt. In the first couple of years, the settlers here depended very much on Johnny Jones and his ship, the Scotia, that regularly brought in supplies from Sydney. But sometimes sailing times could be stretched out by bad weather or other factors, and stocks in Dunedin could simply run out. This happened, for example, in late 1849, when flour ran out completely. James Gebbie, a nurseryman who came from Kilmarnock in Ayrshire and newly arrived in Otago on the Multan, was working for Charles Kettle at the time on his property at Littlebourne, just above where Moana Pool is today. He had orders from his wife to buy a loaf of bread on his way back to their home in North East Valley. But when he went to the baker, there was no bread left and no flour to make any more. Now, I know for myself that when I go to the supermarket and I can't find something on the list that my wife has asked for, she never believes me when I get home and just thinks I didn't look hard enough. So I've got some sympathy for how James Gebbie must have felt as he trudged along on the long walk back to the valley across the boggy ground of the North Dunedin Flat. And sure enough, when he got there, his wife immediately sent him around the neighbours to see if he could beg some bread from one of them. Now, the pioneers were pretty good like that, sharing what they had with each other, as shortages were not infrequent. But in this case, the neighbours didn't have any bread either, and the best James could get was some potatoes. Now, other reminiscences about this incident recount how everyone was reduced to living off potatoes, and this was quite a challenge for the cooks. But as John Wilson records in his history of the early settlement, it was taties at all meals. Taties boiled with their jackets on, taties with their jackets off, taties fried, taties mashed, taties stoved, and taties in point. The other alternative was rice, and Gebbie's reminiscence talks about how his family struggled to make do with rice. They boiled it, they baked it, they fried it, they even tried to make bread with it. The one good thing to come out of this incident was that in its wake, everybody in Dunedin who had a little bit of land began to grow some wheat on it. And the next time there was a shortage, they had something to fall back on. But it was pretty rough stuff, to be honest. The pioneers would thresh their wheat with a flail, winnow it in the wind, and then grind it using whatever they had, often using coffee mills, for example. Or there were a few hand-driven flour mills like this one in the Toitu collection that was brought out from England by James Fulton on the Ajax in 1849 and used at his farm at Woodside. His son, Dr. Robert Fulton, refers to it in his history of the early settlement. I can dimly remember the primitive flour mill working in our little home, the wheat flour falling down. To winnow, a white sheet was placed on the ground, and the grain with chaff put into a riddle or sieve and shaken about over the sheet, the wind carrying the chaff away, leaving the wheat. Later, a small machine called the fanners was used. The bran was separated from the flour and used for bread and scones, and porridge was made from the wheat meal. It was all very labour-intensive and produced what was called overheads, which is flour, bran, and seconds all together in one, and often quite black and smutty. But for desperate people, it was better than nothing, and better than more potatoes and rice for sure. Probably made for pretty good roughage as well. Now, the pioneer housewives used to cook this up and bake bread for themselves in their camp ovens if they had them. And for those who didn't, they would roll the dough together and put it on the hot coals to make what's called damper. And this was a real staple of colonial food for years and years, particularly for men out in the bush or out in the farms on their own. They'd cook up damper bread as a major part of their diet. Now, no sooner had the great 1849 flour shortage been resolved, with new supplies coming in by ship, presumably from Sydney or from Scotland or somewhere, then they ran out of salt. And this was a real problem because it was so essential to so many cooking and other processes. So they resorted to desperate measures again. Barrels that had held salted goods were washed out to try and get all the salt that was left behind in them. And people went down to the beach and scraped up bits of salt off the sand, and then they also began to boil up seawater, taking it home, lighting a fire, and getting every pot and pan in the house with water in it, boiling it off to get the little residue of salt that might be left behind. Now, this was hard work. For a start off, it took huge quantities of fuel to keep all those fires going, and frequent trips down to the waterfront to get more water to bring it home to boil it up. The same situation prevailed from time to time with other staples of the colonial diet: tea, coffee, tobacco. And in each case, when it ran out, the pioneers had to come up with some alternative. So aren't we lucky? Even during the very worst of the pandemic lockdown, we had steady supplies of flour, of tea, of tobacco, and the enormous bonus of toilet paper.